In their adventures, both Frodo and Bilbo passed through a sullen land, hilly, covered in dark forests, and dotted with the ruins of ancient towers. At the time they passed through, these lands were known as the Troll Shores, wild and mostly uninhabited, the only residents being dangerous trolls. But these lands were not always this way. They were once part of the Kingdom of Arnor, and then the heart of the successor kingdom of Rhudaur. Long gone by the War of the Ring, Rhudaur has a dark history, which I shall cover in this video. In 861 of the Third Age, the northern Dunedain kingdom of Arnor suddenly split into three successor realms: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. Arthedain was the largest and strongest of the three realms, ruled by King Amlaeth, the eldest son of King Eärendil of Arnor. Cardolan, the middle realm in both strength and size, mostly located in the flat, treeless land of Minhiriath. And then there was Rhudaur, the smallest and weakest of the three realms, mostly being confined to the hilly lands of eastern Eriador beyond the river Mythythel. The history of the land of Rhudaur is unclear. Its first known settlers were elves, who founded the secret refuge of Rivendell in a hidden valley in the aftermath of the War of the Elves and Sauron. However, they may not have been the first settlers. The hillmen of Rhudaur are shrouded in mystery, but they may have been living there since the First Age. Following the War of the Elves and Sauron, Númenórean settlement began in the lands of Eriador, and some of these seem to have made their ways to the land that would become Rhudaur. The reason for this is unknown. It's possible that they wished to be closer to the elves in Rivendell, or that they believed it could be a way to keep watch over the hillmen who lived in the region. But they were never very large in number, and there's a reason for this. The lands that would become Rhudaur were never very fertile and inviting. Most of the kingdom was situated between the rivers Mythythel, the Bruinen, and the Misty Mountains. These lands were very hilly and covered in dark forests, although it became rocky and treeless the further north you went. Some of the kingdom also extended beyond the river Mythythel to the base of the Weather Hills. But even this land is described as cheerless, with patchy grey grass and stunted clusters of trees and bushes with wide barren spaces in between. The climate was also noticeably colder in the eastern half of Eriador, which included the entirety of the lands that would become Rhudaur. Following the War of the Last Alliance, Arnor was greatly weakened, to the point it had to abandon places that were built during the time of Elendil. Nothing is said about the lands that would become Rhudaur at this time, but King Valandr of Arnor did suffer an early violent death in 652 of the Third Age, which might have been at the hands of the hillmen, although it's all speculation. But in 862, King Eärendil died, and due to the dissension between his sons, Arnor split into three kingdoms: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. We don't know if it was the middle son or the youngest son who took Rhudaur. What followed was a pointless, wasteful conflict that lasted for almost 500 years, further weakening the Dunedain. The focal point of this war was usually Amon Sul, Weathertop, and the Palantir that was held there. Although it was in Arthedain's hands, it was close to both the borders of Cardolan and Rhudaur, so they both wanted possession of it. This conflict only came to an end with the ascension of King Argoleb I in Arthedain, but unfortunately, this was only the start of a larger, even more deadly war. The civil wars in Arnor had gradually weakened the Dunedain, and nowhere was this felt worse than in Rhudaur. Already a minority in Rhudaur, the Dunedain found their control over the country slipping. Shortly before Argoleb claimed Arnor, a lord of the hillmen had assumed control of Rhudaur, ousting the Dunedain minority from power, although at least some of them remained in the country. Whereas Cardolan accepted Argoleb's claim and took a position as a junior realm led by a prince, Rhudaur rejected Argoleb and instead went to war. The reason for this was that this unnamed Lord of the Hillmen had a powerful, secret new ally, Angmar, a realm which had arisen to the north of the Etenmoors around 50 years earlier, ruled by the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of the Nazgul, although this was unknown at the time. Shortly after Rhudaur's rejection, Argoleb fortified the Weather Hills. In response, Rhudaur, backed by Angmar, attacked, and found initial success by killing Argoleb. Argoleb's son, Arveleg I, with the help of Cardolan and elves from Lindon, succeeded in driving back the enemies from the Weather Hills, and they established a frontier along the hills, the Great Road, and the Lower Mythythel. possibly in response to Lindon siding with Arthedain. Rivendell was besieged around this time. But this was merely a precursor. In 1409, the Angmar-Rhudaur alliance made its next big move. A massive army crossed the Mythythel and broke into Cardolan, ravaging the land and reducing the Dunedain there to footholds in the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest. Amon Sul was surrounded, destroyed, and King Arveleg was killed, although the Palantir was saved. It was only at Fornost and the North Downs itself where the new King Arathor was able to drive back the attackers, once again with the help from the Elves of Lindon. The Rhudaur-Angmar alliance had the upper hand. Arthedain was weakened, Cardolan was nearly destroyed. But Angmar did not emerge from the war unscathed. The siege of Rivendell was broken around this time, and with forces from both Lindon and Lothlorien, the elves subdued Angmar for a time, although they did not destroy it. The Rhudaur-Angmar alliance, however, had come to an end. In that same year of 1409, evil men from Angmar moved south and occupied Rhudaur. The few Dunedain who still remained, whether they truly believed in the war against Arthedain or whether they simply didn't want to abandon their homes, were either killed or driven west. In the south, the Stores, hobbits, who lived in the land known as the Angle, also abandoned their homes and fled west. As for the Hillmen, we're unsure of their fate. Most of them may have stayed, some of them may have fled, but whatever the case, they were no longer in power. The men of Khand Dûm were. The reason for Angmar's occupation of Rhudaur is never stated, although we can make some guesses. Perhaps the Witch King saw no reason for an independent Rhudaur, and decided it would be better off incorporated into Angmar. Perhaps his allies in Rhudaur had grown wary of the evil in Angmar, perhaps they were having second thoughts about the alliance, perhaps they were not simply pulling their weight, and the Witch King believed he could better extract resources from that land while it was under his direct control. Whatever the reason, in 1409, the Kingdom of Rhudaur effectively ceased as an independent kingdom, and the land would become a bastion of evil. Underneath Angmar, the men who dwelt in Rhudaur, whether hillmen or men of Angmar, would learn dark sorceries. This they demonstrated in 1636. When the Great Plague wiped out the remaining Dunedain of Cardolan, dark spirits were sent forth from Angmar and Rhudaur to occupy the Barrow Downs. They would become known as the Barrowites. The men of Rhudaur would build dark towers and ominous castles in the hills beyond the Mythythel. The ruins of these could still be seen by the time of the War of the Ring, leaving a dark shadow upon the land. But just as Rhudaur had risen high with Angmar, it would also fall with Angmar. In 1974, Angmar finally overcame Arthedain and Fornost was conquered, but the following year a relief army from Gondor arrived. The Witch King was decisively defeated at the Battle of Fornost, and the forces of Gondor led by Prince Eärnur and the elven forces led by Glorfindel entered the lands held by Angmar. This time, Angmar was more than merely subdued. Then so utterly was Angmar defeated that not a man nor an orc of that realm remained west of the mountains. Whatever men remained in Rhudaur at this time were wiped out or fled, leaving only dark ruins behind. There has been some debate about just how empty Rhudaur remained for the rest of the Third Age. Although Aragorn states that the lands have long been empty, Bilbo's trolls do claim to have eaten a village and a half between them, implying that there might be men who still lived in the area, at least up until that point. However, this is somewhat dubious evidence. Bilbo is an unreliable narrator, the trolls could be lying, and the way the trolls say it could mean that they've eaten a village and a half's worth of food, rather than a literal village and a half. Weird unit of measurement, but trolls aren't exactly smart. So there might have been men left in the area, but we would be taking the word of a group of trolls over that of Aragorn's. All that said, we do know two other groups that still lived in the lands that used to belong to Rhudaur. As you might have guessed, the first group was trolls. They had lived in the Etten Moors for many long years, but with Angmar's fall, those that survived fled east over the Misty Mountains. But around the year 2700 of the Third Age, they returned, and as Aragorn's grandfather Rhudaur and later Bilbo discovered, they sometimes came down from the Etten Moors and made their lairs in the lands below, hence the name, the Trollshores. And the other group, funnily enough, was the Dunedain Rangers. Despite the fact that Rhudaur was the first land to fall to evil, it was a land that could hide the Dunedain that remained after the fall of Arnor. Most of them dwelt in the land called the Angle, a wooded, narrow strip of land between the rivers Mythythel and the Bruinen. This was long theorized thanks to a note that was in circulation, but was finally confirmed by Nature of Middle-earth. Though not all of the Dunedain lived in the Angle. Rhudaur, who I mentioned just before, apparently lived in a house in the north of the Cold Shores, just below the Etten Moors. Unfortunately, the location of his house is probably the reason why he was killed by trolls. What happened to Rhudaur in the 4th Age is anyone's guess. Considering it was part of the old borders of Arnor, it was most likely reincorporated into the reunited kingdom, but it probably remained mostly uninhabited for many decades at the very least, possibly even centuries. With the rebuilding of cities such as Annúminas and Fornost, the Dunedain who lived in the Angle probably would have moved away, and given how depopulated Rhudaur was, there would have been many other better lands to be settled before one considered the dark hilly lands of Rhudaur that would remind one of the shadow of the past. But considering men once lived there before, they probably ended up living there again at some point. Whether the name Rhudaur was ever used again, we'll never know. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. As you all know, I love anything to do with Arnor, so after doing a video on Cardolan, it wasn't going to be long before I did one on Rhudaur. And when I mean long, I mean probably that was several months ago now, so it actually has been quite long. That leaves Arthedain, which I'm sure we'll see sometime in the future, provided I don't get killed by a troll. Cheers, farewell, and remember, farewell and cheers.